In the Department of Defense authored summary of the National Defense Strategy of the United States for 2018, Secretary James Mattis quite succinctly sets out the challenges and goals of the U.S. military in the immediate future. He acknowledges that the U.S. had become far too focused on counter-insurgency over the past 2 decades, but he seems to miss the causation of this fixation in the first place. The United States engaged in costly and unnecessary wars, and when these wars were easily won on the immediate battlefield, the unplanned for occupations led to guerrilla insurgencies that a conventional military is ill-prepared to confront. The U.S. military and the defense industry were forced to find ways to adapt tactics and equipment to this new kind of conflict, thus shifting the main effort away from fighting conventional wars against peer adversaries. Meanwhile, the U.S. political and military leadership, without recognizing and acknowledging its failures, has unfathomably declared that the U.S. is now in an acute period of strategic competition with the other 2 strongest world players. The current situation can be traced back to a global power vacuum created with the collapse of the Soviet Union in December of 1991. Just scant months prior, the United States deployed military forces to Saudi Arabia as the backbone of an international coalition to confront and reverse the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. This resulted in Operation Desert Shield, the greatest deployment of combined military forces on the part of the U.S. military since the Vietnam War. The conventional military power utilized by the U.S. was greatly effective. The first post-Cold War military humanitarian intervention conducted by the U.S. was the Yugoslavian civil conflict interdiction of 1995. At the conclusion of the U.S. intervention in the Balkans, which included the deployment of U.S. ground forces as part of multiple NATO-led operations including Operation Joint Endeavour, Operation Joint Guard, and Joint Forge in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and the Kosovo Force KFOR, the United States would de facto create the statelet of Kosovo. Although the U.S. military leadership was pleased with the performance of its legacy armored vehicles and weapon systems in both Operation Desert Storm and Operation Joint Endeavour, it was not satisfied with the amount of time required to deploy large combined arms units via available sea lift and airlift capacity. The complex logistics involved in mobilizing and moving heavy armored units does not lend well to rapid deployments. The desire to streamline U.S. military logistics and to create a fighting force that was more rapidly deployable, flexible, and yet maintained the highest levels of lethality, and that leveraged advanced information technologies and communication systems led to the genesis of the Future Combat System, or FCS. Embracing the FCS concept, the Army set very high deployment goals, which would prove to be unattainable. General Eric Shinseki, then Chief of Staff of the Army, stated that the Army would strive to attain the ability to deploy a combat brigade anywhere in the world within 96 hours, a full division within 120 hours, and no less than 5 divisions in 30 days. The U.S. Army would eventually pursue the FCS program, largest defense acquisition program in U.S. military history, with a price tag of approximately $200 billion. The program was eventually cancelled in 2009. Yet its influence in transforming the U.S. Army has proven substantial. The United States military would become a force for invasion and occupation during the neocon era, spanning from 2000 to the present. By 2003, the U.S. was once again invading Iraqi territory, this time during Operation Iraqi Freedom. The Iraqi military was far weaker in 2003 than it had been in 1991. Ground operations of the invasion lasted from March the 20th until May the 1st, 2003. The initial victory was impressive, but it soon became quite obvious that there was no realistic and pragmatic plan to occupy the country and render aid to a stable and capable new government. What followed was a time of crisis for the U.S. military, when the U.S. soldiers were not greeted as liberators and a number of organized and ruthless anti-occupation insurgencies formed, some motivated by patriotism, some by tribal and religious factions, and still others by terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda. The soldiers tasked with the occupation of Iraq were woefully unprepared for the task. Convoys and patrols were increasingly the targets of ambushes by insurgents. Light vehicles and military transports were targeted and destroyed in significant numbers, and the crews had no protection from weapons ranging from small arms and RPGs to extremely powerful improvised explosive devices, or IEDs. The answer was to add armored protection to all existing vehicles, whether they be HMMWVs or the LMTVs and HEMMTs of the logistics units. Adding armor to logistical support vehicles are not meant to see frontline combat greatly reduced their fuel efficiency, great importance in the logistics arm, and was only accomplished at great cost. The US Army only had one armored security vehicle in active service at this time, the M1117, albeit in small numbers. The decision was made to armor the ubiquitous HMM-WV and to give it the tasks of armored patrol, internal security, and crowd control vehicle. A number of different armor packages were developed for the HMM-WV, mainly to increase the likelihood of crew survivability. The armored Hummer was merely a stopgap until purpose-built armored vehicles could be developed and fielded in greater numbers. Although effective against high-caliber small arms, shrapnel, and mines, the M1117 was fielded in very limited numbers in 2003, with military police units mostly in security duties on US military installations. Large orders for the vehicle were placed after the 2003 Iraq invasion, and the number grew from approximately 50 to over 1,800 units in active service. Between 2003 and 2007, the US military would suffer increasing casualties in both the Iraq and Afghanistan theaters of occupation. In the case of Afghanistan, casualties would continue to increase until 2010, before decreasing over consecutive years. Most of these casualties were the result of ambushes with IEDs. Such attacks increased sixfold from 2003 to 2007. The DoD would award billions of dollars in contracts for mine-resistant ambushed protected vehicles, or MRAPs, between 2003 and the present. Total acquisition costs of the various MRAPs ordered and put into service conservatively exceeds $45 billion. The US military has no less than 7 types of MRAPs in service as of today, more than any other nation by far. As the US has reduced its active footprint in both Afghanistan and Iraq, it has sold many of these vehicles to local security forces and even US domestic police forces, as they are of little use on a contested battlefield where the US military would be fighting a conventional conflict with a powerful adversary. The US military experience with occupation and counter-insurgency also resulted in an over-focusing of resources towards a traditionally elite, limited, and specialized subset of conventional fighting forces, special operations. All effective modern national defense forces operate a small cadre of special operations units. These units are comprised of highly motivated, highly trained, and highly skilled soldiers who can perform any number of military tasks, but are specifically focused on asymmetrical, hybrid, and very specialized warfare subsets. Prior to the US wars of occupation of Afghanistan and Iraq, the United States operated a robust special operations force comprising of units from all services. The considerable investment in these highly selective forces, the high standards demanded, and the extremely difficult training requirements have always kept these forces small. However, this has changed a great deal over the past 17 years. The need for soldiers with a skill set specific to counterinsurgency in Iraq and Afghanistan led to increased focus and demand on special operations. From 2001 to the present, the Special Operations Forces under the Special Operations Command, or SOCOM, have expanded from 42,800 to approximately 63,500 today. Special Operations specific funding has grown fourfold in the same time period, from $3.1 billion to $12.3 billion. According to SOCOM, an average of 8,300 special operators are deployed in missions in as many as 149 nations across the globe on a weekly basis, and 70 nations on any given day. This overemphasis on special operations has resulted in atrophying of more conventional combat forces. Secretary Mattis has obviously recognized the need to focus higher procurement towards conventional forces, as well as fund R&D efforts into developing a new field artillery, rocket artillery, armored fighting vehicles such as the AMPV, and a new main battle tank, MBT. In identifying near-peer adversaries as the greatest national security threat, Secretary Mattis realizes that the US must waste no time in closing the technological and quality gap that now exists between the conventional fighting forces of the United States and Russia and China, respectively. The United States surely has the economic resources and the technical capability to do so. While the ground forces of the United States have suffered from 2 decades of occupation and counterinsurgency, the US Navy seems to have lost any idea of its national security role. After 2 decades of enjoying uncontested control of the seas and the ability to use aircraft carrier-borne airstrikes to pummel inferior adversaries, none of which possessed a viable navy or air force, nor a modern air defense network or shore-based anti-naval capability, the US Navy has seemed determined to sail further into the realm of irrelevancy in any further conflict. The United States Navy has not engaged in any major naval engagement with a major adversary since the closing days of World War II. Regardless, the US Navy apparently has decided it is an indomitable force that can go wherever it pleases without opposition. Such hubris and arrogance are one of the reasons why it is in such poor shape today. The other reason must surely be attributed to a military-industrial complex that has sold the service on an expensive pipe dream of high-tech weapons that have failed to live up to their hype, or to the tune of huge profits. The following are the most egregious examples. Based on a flawed concept from the start, a radical departure from a traditional multi-purpose design, the littoral combat ship was largely doomed for a number of reasons. Two different designs were awarded contracts, the Independent class, designed by General Dynamics, and the Freedom class, designed by Lockheed Martin. The decision to produce two different designs to meet the needs of a single class should have been seen as problematic. Here the Navy accepted the responsibility and costs associated with maintaining two different platforms with separate maintenance needs and schedules, not to mention two separate training programs for LCS crews. The concept of the LCS was also divergent in many respects, and quite frankly, too much was expected of a ship that was smaller in size than a conventional frigate. What resulted was what those serving in the force would begrudgingly coin the little crappy ship. The aluminium and composite, Independence class, and lightweight steel or Freedom class hulls of the ship provide little armored protection. Offensive striking power is totally inadequate, the platform has yet to meet many of its design requirements, and the reduced crew size has been determined to be unmanageable. As a result of its overwhelming failure to meet the expectations of the US Navy or congressional oversight, the total fleet size of LCS vessels has been reduced from the original 50 planned down to 32. Project cost overruns, a number of high-profile system failures, and the smaller fleet size have resulted in a total cost of $12.4 billion for the first 26 vessels. The US Congress capped the per-unit cost at $480 million per ship, bringing the theoretical total cost to $15.5 billion, all for a ship that has a minimal chance of surviving most modern naval combat scenarios. There is little wonder why the US Navy has decided to start building a multi-purpose frigate, dubbed the FFG-X, to pick up where the LCS has failed. If the LCS was not a huge and unequivocal disappointment, then the much-vaulted stealth destroyer, the DDG-1000 Zumwalt class, was a total embarrassment and unmitigated failure. Envisioned as a high-tech game-changer, the DDG-1000 was supposed to make use of powerful new technologies, overwhelming firepower, and massive power generation, all wrapped in stealth that would render it invisible. Although designed as a multi-mission surface combatant, added emphasis was put on Naval Surface Fire Support, NSFS, while operating in littoral waters. Originally, the Navy intended to build 32 of these stealth destroyers, yet the exorbitant initial cost plus huge cost overruns led the Navy and the US Congress to reduce the fleet repeatedly, finally settling on only 3 vessels. Correspondingly, the cost per vessel increased tremendously, as did the cost of all class-specific systems, including weapons systems, power generation, and propulsion systems. Cost per vessel stands at over $7.5 billion. The Mark 51 Advanced Gun System, AGS, deck guns designed specifically for the DDG-1000s were made to fire guided rounds over a range in excess of 80 nautical miles with extreme accuracy. These guns were designed to strike shore targets accurately from coastal waters in support of Allied ground forces and amphibious landing forces. Lockheed Martin and BAE Systems developed the long-range land attack projectile for use in the AGS, but due to the now 3-vessel fleet, the per-unit cost of each LR/LAP has risen to over $800,000. The first 2 vessels in class have both experienced main engine failures and damages. The US Michael Monsoor DDG-1001 suffered damage to the turbine blades of one of its main engines during sea trials in February of this year. The MT-30 engine will have to be replaced at a cost of $20 million. The USSS Zumwalt DDG-1000 famously broke down during its transit from Maine to San Diego and had to be towed from the Panama Canal to its new home port. The US Navy is now struggling to find a new role for the DDG-1000s. Now that its fire support mission is a non-starter, it has been adapted as a platform to strike inland targets with land attack cruise missiles and engage other surface ships with an anti-ship cruise missile that has yet to be fielded. In an attempt to utilize the USSS Zumwalt, the Navy has added legacy weapon systems, radars, and communications antennas to the stealthy superstructure, undoubtedly negating its minimal radar signature. It remains to be seen what munitions will be provided for the 2 AGS turrets, as no munitions other than the cost-prohibitive LR/LAP exist. As if the US Navy was not content with wasting $38 billion on the failed LCS and DDG-1000 programs, An even more grandiose undertaking was envisioned for the service that would revolutionize the largely obsolete supercarrier. It is widely accepted fact that the US Navy has been obsessed with the aircraft carrier since World War II and the pivotal naval battles between the US Navy and the Imperial Japanese Navy. This obsession is alive and well to this day, seemingly immune to the realities of modern missile technology, especially in regard to guidance, speed, range, and the advent of armed and semi-autonomous unmanned aerial vehicles, UAV, of increasing lethality. In 2005, the US Navy embarked on a program to replace the existing Nimitz-class nuclear-powered aircraft carriers currently comprising the central components of the Aircraft Carrier Strike Group's ASG, of which the service operates 10. The General R. Ford class was supposed to take advantage of a number of new technologies and experience significantly improved efficiencies in aircraft carrier operations over the preceding Nimitz class. While the initial cost estimate for CVN-78 was around $10 billion, the total cost for the vessel has exceeded $13 billion as of May this year, when it was revealed that the advanced weapons elevator and a main thrust bearing had suffered damage in sea trials and required repair. The CVN-78 is by far the most expensive warship ever constructed. In a controversial move, it was decided to try and incorporate a number of new, unproven systems in the new design. In retrospect, this decision was bound to result in cost overruns and a more problematic breaking-in period. New systems integrated into the Gerald R. Ford include an electromagnetic launching system, EMALS, advanced aircraft arresting system, advanced weapons elevator system, dual-band radar, and a more powerful nuclear reactor. There was much discussion in the Navy regarding the wisdom of introducing so many new technologies in a single platform. Many senior officers argued that there were bound to be serious delays in working through the problems associated with rendering so many new technologies operational. This opinion turned out to be of merit, as the Gerald R. Ford immediately experienced problems with just about all of its new systems. The vessel has experienced two main propulsion malfunctions over the past year. The advanced arresting gear, EMALS, and other critical systems have displayed poor or unknown reliability, according to the Naval Operational and Test Evaluation Force. In early testing, the EMALS was unable to launch F-18 strike aircraft at weights even close to full combat load. All of these problems or shortcomings were revealed during sea trials, and the vessel returned to shipyard in Newport News, Virginia on July 15, 2018 to undergo extensive repairs and improvements. As much as President Trump and various administration officials and senators tout the power of the U.S. military, often citing an increasing defense budget as an indicator of strength, efficiency, and effectiveness, there is little doubt that U.S. naval aviation has atrophied over decades of misuse, neglect, and poor decision-making at the highest levels. Not only is it in disrepair, but it is ill-equipped for a fight against a peer adversary. In the last decade of the Cold War naval competition between the US and the USSR, the Nimitz-class aircraft carriers deployed with 9 or even 10 squadrons of fixed-wing aircraft. Today, that has been reduced to 6. Greater importance, the only aircraft utilized for combat operations is the FA-18 Hornet and Super Hornet, with all of its inherent shortcomings. Most importantly, its limited operational range of 370 nautical miles. The aircraft replaced the A-7 Corsair II and A-4 Skyhawk in the Navy and the F-4 Phantom in the USMC all had much longer operational ranges, and all but the A-4 had greater weapons payload capacity. The FA-18 is a jack of all trades and a master of none. In an attempt to lower costs by using one airframes for all roles, the US Navy has been left to rely on a less capable tool for many missions. What has resulted is an aircraft carrier air wing that is less capable in all respects and cannot compete and excel in a future conflict with a peer adversary. Although the super improved Hornet is significantly larger than its predecessor and gains about 100 nautical miles in range due to larger internal fuel capacity, it still lacks the required range needed to protect its carrier. Not surprisingly, even though there was a better option, the Navy decided to use the FA-18s for aerial refueling duties as well. The S-3 Viking has been kept in service as a carrier-borne aerial tanker, having given up its original role as an ASW aircraft, and was superior to the FA-18 in this respect. Although most S-3s in service still had approximately 12,000 hours of service life left on their airframes, the Navy pushed ahead with their retirement in 2009, with a much greater range than the FA-18 and a fuel capacity of 16,000 pounds. The S-3 was better and far cheaper solution. The fact that it was a far cheaper option was probably its downfall. Profit drives the US military-industrial complex, not efficiency or performance. The second issue, which is perhaps more damning, is the fact that the FA-18 squadrons that the Navy relies on to conduct almost all carrier air wing duties are in an alarming state of disrepair. The Navy announced in February of 2017 that 2/3 or 62% of all FA-18 Hornets and Super Hornets were unserviceable due to maintenance issues. 27% of these aircraft were undergoing major maintenance depot work, not minor or preventative maintenance. Of the 542 total FA-18 and EF-18 Hornets, only 170 were mission capable. What good is a huge, high-tech aircraft carrier with an air wing that is limited in range and capability? If the US Navy does manage to get the first 3 Gerald R. Ford-class carriers in service, how many FA-18E Super Hornets will be mission capable to fly from there? Are the F-35C and F-35B Joint Strike Fighters meant to complete the complement of strike and fighter aircraft finally going to be available for deployment? Seeing that the F-35 does not close the missile gap that threatens the US aircraft carriers in general, is the Navy soliciting the defense industry to produce a carrier-borne aircraft, whether manned or unmanned, to correct this obvious weakness? Russian and Chinese anti-ship ballistic missiles and hypersonic cruise missiles can strike US carriers long before their aircraft can get within range of striking the territories of either of these near-peer adversaries. After a short review of the Navy's decision to settle on a single airframe to fill all of the roles of the carrier air wing, it should come of little surprise that the Pentagon would come to a similar decision on a much broader scale. A cursory study of combat aviation history has proven that there is no one-size-fits-all solution to the many combat functions performed by military aviation. The story of the development of the Joint Fight Striker, JSF, is a cautionary tale of weapons development program that was ill-conceived and soon spiraled out of control. Perhaps the most controversial and scandalous of any such program, the JSF, is the costliest weapons program in world history. Newly revised estimates from the Pentagon put the cost of development and procurement of the 2,056 fighters the DoD wants at $406.1 billion. The total cost to procure these aircraft and maintain them over the 20-year lifespan of the aircraft exceeds $1.5 trillion. While the F-35A first flew in 2006, the only US military branch to declare the F-35 operation and to use it in combat is the USMC. The F-35 was developed from the outset for export to allied nations, and Israel has reportedly used the F-35 for strikes against some targets in the Middle East. Approximately 300 units of all versions have been produced so far for both the US military and foreign militaries, yet only Israel and the USMC have declared the aircraft combat ready. Not only has the F-35 not attained a wide operational status 17 years after its first flight, but it has pulled an exorbitant amount of funding from existing combat-proven aircraft. The fact that 62% of the US Navy's F-18s are not mission-capable is not an anomaly. In 2017, approximately 72% of all US Air Force aircraft were not flight-worthy. Both the Navy and Air Force claim that there is not enough money in their respective budgets to procure the needed spare parts to keep these aircraft flying. One would wonder that if this is the case, why tens of billions of dollars are being poured into new aircraft when existing fleets are being left in disrepair. While the Army has made some progress in procuring the first of the 49,099 Joint Light Tactical Vehicles it wants, it is far behind in all other armored vehicle procurement and development programs. BAE has delivered the first batch of 29 AMPVs to the US Army for extensive testing before the decision can be made to start low-rate initial production. The Army wants at least 3,000 AMPVs of 6 different main variants to replace the thousands of M113 armored vehicles still in service. The M113 first saw service in 1962, and a replacement for the vehicle has been required for decades. Defense Secretary James Mattis made it crystal clear in his national defense strategy that the US must rebuild its conventional warfare capabilities. The US Army's proposed 2019 budget lays bare the new priorities of a service facing a major transition in priorities. Procurement of tracked combat vehicles, as well as artillery rounds, rockets, and missiles account for much of this latest budget request. Procurement is up by 18.4% over the previous year, with procurement of weapons and tracked vehicles up 84% over the previous year. As the US Army attempts to rebuild its aged and depleted armored brigade, combat teams, and conventional rocket artillery, The US Navy and Air Force are facing their own challenges. The Navy finds itself in a position that is far from enviable, but it was very easy to predict. Having dumped $38 billion into two failed new classes of warships and a further $13 billion into a new aircraft carrier that will likely not become operational until 2022, the service is currently in the process of realigning its priorities. The service is struggling to procure the new Virginia-class SSN and Columbia-class SSBNs that are required to ensure the viability of the nation's nuclear deterrent triad well into the foreseeable future. These defensive weapons programs, which are integral to U.S. national security, could have benefited greatly from the $51 billion wasted on the LCS, DDG-1000, and the Gerald R-4 programs. Russia and China have spent the same time wasted by the US Navy on updating and modernizing their own submarine forces, chiefly their ballistic missile submarines. If one had to identify the main reason behind the utter failure of the US political establishment and military leadership, both civilian and in uniform, to identify and prioritize weapons programs and procurement that was truly in line with the national defense needs of the country, it would be the institutional corruption of the US military-industrial complex. Massive defense budgets do not lead to powerful military forces nor sound national defense strategy. The United States is the most glaring example of how a nation's treasure can be wasted, its citizens robbed for generations, and its political processes undermined by an industry bent on maximizing profitability by encouraging and exacerbating conflict. President Donald Trump was very proud to announce the largest U.S. military budget in the nation's history last year. The United States spent no less than $874.4 billion. The declared base budget for 2017 was $523.2 billion. Yet, there are also the overseas contingency operations and support budgets that have to be considered in determining the total cost. The total DoD annual costs have doubled from 2003 to the present. If there is sufficient political will to work against a military-industrial complex in the interests of true national defense and fiscal responsibility, the U.S. Department of Defense will be able to rectify the current endemic problems by taking the following steps. Abandon the obsession with counter-insurgency and occupation and realign the focus of the Army on the defense of a homeland and a handful of historical allies. Rebuild the Army as a lean and well-equipped conventional fighting force. The focus should be on defense of the nation's own territories, while also safeguarding the economic interests and maritime trade lanes that are the lifeblood of any nation. All legacy systems that have proven capable and efficient on the modern battlefield should be refurbished and upgraded to the most modern standard. The M2 Bradley modernization program should be continued, and the AMPV program given increased priority so that the thousands of M113 vehicles can finally end their 56-year tour of duty. MRAP inventories should be reduced to the very minimum, and all surplus units sold off to recoup some of the expense incurred in their procurement, and the money directed into offsetting procurement costs of new AMPVs and JLTVs. The JLTV platform is a modular, easily upgradable light tactical vehicle that can be tailored to fit the mission. Although most units should be the basic utility variant, many will need to be acquired to fill the roles light armored reconnaissance, armored security, convoy security, and light special operations vehicles. An airdroppable airborne armored fighting vehicle should be developed based on the JLTV. The U.S. Airborne Forces have lacked any real armored fighting vehicle that can accompany them in parachute operations since the M551 was retired in 1996. Of greatest importance is the rejuvenation of the armored and mechanized units of the U.S. Army. The M1126 Stryker family of wheeled armored vehicles cannot bear the weight of a conventional conflict with either Russia or China. The M1A2 SEP V4 MBT upgrade, including the addition of the Trophy APS, should be afforded adequate funding, yet the greatest need of the Army is the replacement of the M113 in combat units. The U.S. Army's proposed 3,000 unit procurement of AMPVs is a good start. The artillery arm of the U.S. Army must gain attention it has lacked since the dissolving of the Soviet Union and the success of Operation Desert Storm. U.S. military planners and the leadership of the DoD must realize the continued importance of both conventional and rocket artillery on the modern battlefield. The U.S. Army only operates two self-propelled artillery systems, the M109 Paladin and the M270 MLRS. This is not necessarily a bad thing as long as both systems are maintained, upgraded, and fielded in sufficient number. The M109A7 upgrade program must gain greater funding in the immediate future. The LCS and DDG-1000 programs are a national disgrace and should be declared as such. The two existing DDG-1000s should be used as test beds for future engineering and weapons systems. The third vessel should be cancelled immediately, As for the LCS, the existing fleet should be used for littoral patrol duties, and all units currently under construction or planned should be cancelled. The FFG-X program to design a modern yet conventional multi-purpose frigate for the US Navy should be fully embraced. The new frigate should adhere to the traditional naval warfare duties of a frigate and should be designed to sufficiently fulfill a balance of AAW, ASW, and surface warfare missions. In conjunction, priority should be given to procurement of the new DDG-51 Arleigh-Burke Flight 3. The Arleigh-Burke has been the backbone of the US Navy since it entered service. It is a well-designed, balanced, flexible, and powerful naval combatant of significant displacement. The US Navy must outgrow the supercarrier fixation. There is a future for aircraft carriers, yet on a far different pattern than what the US Navy has operated for the past 50 years. The greatest area of concern for the US Navy is the weakness of the carrier air wing, a weakness that will not be fundamentally corrected by the introduction of the F-35 in the US Navy and USMC service aboard US carriers. A new, longer-range fleet defense aircraft, akin to a modern F-14 Tomcat, must be developed. In addition, a new attack aircraft must be developed with a range that exceeds that of the F-18 Super Hornet by a factor of 100%. Additionally, the S-3 Viking must be retasked as a carrier-borne aerial tanker, and the many airframes now mothballed, yet with thousands of hours of use remaining, need to be repurposed to this task. The current carrier air wing as it stands, even with the introduction of the F-35, is of little utility against a peer adversary such as Russia or China. The United States must acquire both an SSN and SSBN to replace the Los Angeles and Ohio-class vessels that are approaching the end of their service lives. There is no greater defensive role for the US Navy in ensuring the security of the nation than the continued operation of its attack and ballistic missile submarine forces. Both Russia and China understand this and have greatly modernized their own submarine forces. Much of the success they have achieved in pushing the envelope of submarine design was due to their intense competition with the US Navy submarine force that was always at the cutting edge of subsurface warfare. The United States stands at the crossroads in many respects, and the nation's military equally so. The United States military is in its weakest state of material strength and readiness since the conclusion of the Cold War. The conventional ground forces of the Army have been transformed into a force bent on occupation and counter-insurgency. Its heavy armored formations are in a state of disrepair and material inferiority vis-à-vis its most capable theoretical adversaries. The cornerstone of American power, projection, and intimidation, the aircraft carrier strike groups are a sad shadow of their former self. The carrier air wing, the entire reason that an aircraft carrier exists in the first place, has developed into a tool of increasingly limited utility, with an ever-decreasing reach. In any theoretical situation where the nation finds itself at war against Russia or China, and likely an alliance of the two, the United States military has never been in a weaker position. Such a conflict would be of no benefit to any of the nations concerned, yet many potential flashpoints exist that could lead to a conflict, including the South China Sea, Syria, or Ukraine. As the United States plays catch-up after decades of military adventurism, China and Russia have spent that time patiently and judiciously gathering their strength. The scenario of a one-sided victory in favor of the United States is pure fantasy.